Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, Episode 3.
Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, the podcast that helps you best work with anxious kids and teens. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Today on the show, we have Rob Baumgartner. Rob is an old friend of mine and agreed to come on the show to talk about his experiences of childhood and teen anxiety. As you'll see, it's something that he really became aware of in retrospect later in his life. He has a fascinating life story that has a lot of twists and turns in it that got him to where he is today. I thought it would be great to have Rob on the show to look at some of the ways in which anxiety may not always be readily apparent. I also thought it would be good to talk about substance abuse and how self-medicating for anxiety is at first very effective, but eventually not only ineffective, but ultimately counterproductive. I also think that the work that Rob does now, helping people connect with others and lead a more active lifestyle, are wonderful ways to mitigate anxiety and also substance use. It's a very raw and open and honest conversation, and I think you will really appreciate a lot of Rob's hard-won insights about himself, anxiety, substances, and helping others. Before we dive into the show, I want to give a quick shout out to our presenting sponsor, Mount Genie. If you have a smart speaker like an Alexa or a Google Home, you really should check them out. I have my Google Wi-Fi router nicely mounted where you would never see it, and all the cords are tucked away with one of their mounts. They also have ones where you can mount it flush with the wall for a really slick look. I really do love their stuff. Be sure to check out their products on Amazon and mountgenie.com. And don't forget, as a listener of this podcast, you can use the code ANXIETY10, all one word, to get 10% off. All right, without further ado, here's me and Rob Baumgartner. Enjoy. Okay, welcome, Rob. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It's good to see you and really appreciate you coming on. And I think that you have a really interesting and great story to share with everybody. So if you're up for it, man, we'll just dive right in.
Sure. Yeah. Where do you want me to start?
Well, why don't we start kind of, I guess, just back at the beginning of you growing up and just sort of what that was like for you. And if you remember having any anxiety or anything sort of situationally that bothered you or things that you can remember like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for me, the first time I really, identified it as such, I was quite a bit older, probably in my 30s before I really thought of the term anxiety. I think maybe it just wasn't used as much when we were younger. But I guess I was kind of a nervous kid, right? And a shy kid.
Yeah.
One thing I can remember is when I was quite young, about 5 years old, wanting to buy candy at a store. I had a couple dollars to buy candy, but the thought of going up to the counter, and I wasn't really sure how the transaction worked, was something that made me really nervous, right? It was something I didn't want to do and make a fool of myself. And so I got my younger brother, who was, 3 years old, to go and make the transaction for me. And that sort of thing has carried with me through much of my life, right? It's improved over the years, but I still had situations like that where anything sort of new business wise will give me a little bit of a sense of, how's that going to be?
So the early stuff that you remember, it sounds like it was avoidance of things that you felt like were potentially anxiety provoking.
Yeah, I think, and I wouldn't have thought of it as such. It was just that I didn't want to embarrass myself, right? And like a really keen sense of being just aware of myself, self-conscious, I guess.
Okay.
Not wanting to make a fool of myself, but so many possible situations that I think people would consider pretty pedestrian. I was sort of afraid to do that. And so I would often just avoid those situations. Yeah.
Okay. So that you remember feeling that way kind of when you were really young, you were about 5. Anything else come to mind kind of as you got older? I'm imagining what you're talking about is that almost kind of heightened sort of self-consciousness, worried about, well, how's this going to make me look, like self-esteem, et cetera. So I'm kind of thinking ahead already even to teenage years where all that stuff is magnified anyway. Do you have any recollections of that kind of stuff when you were that age?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a particularly athletic kid, and I think the focus on athletics in terms of one's social standing was particularly high in junior high years, and so
Mhm.
I also didn't have, my father wasn't particularly into sports and we didn't play a lot of catch or anything like
Yeah.
that. So
Uh-huh.
every time I had to try to learn a new sport in gym class, I mean, starting in fifth grade, I can remember I didn't know how to dribble a basketball, with one hand. That just seemed impossible to me. And all these other kids were running in circles around me. So just the sense of being kind of embarrassed and like, ooh, I just don't want to do that was pretty profound, starting pretty young.
Mm.
So a lot of the time I try to avoid those things, but of course then you just don't learn how to play that sport or whatever, and it doesn't make things better.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. So much of treatment around anxiety now is based on you being able to confront that stuff directly. It's exposure and response prevention. So you there's something you're afraid of, you go right into it in smaller measured doses. So it's not so overwhelming because, as you said, the avoidance just makes it worse, and then you're never really developing that skill to get through it.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me. In the last several years, I've taught a lot of people to rock climb. And one of the things that comes up there is, a lot of people are afraid of that for any number of reasons, right? Maybe it's a social thing and they don't feel very fit and they might not be good at it. They also might be afraid of heights, but that kind of getting them into what we call like the yellow zone, right? But not pushing them past into the red, right? So where they're a little bit anxious maybe to get on the wall, but you can say, why don't you just take a couple steps up and hang on the rope, right? And then you can sit back and come back down and give folks a couple tries. So like you said, you're pushing a little bit, but not pushing somebody to where it actually sort of makes things worse, right? Where they have a mildly traumatic experience because they're hanging on a rope and they don't want to get down, right?
That could certainly be traumatic.
I guess I'm familiar with that just without any clinical background.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Process. Yeah.
So you remember those kind of times in like junior high where it's like the classic, like, I don't want to go out and play basketball, but I have to because I'm in gym class, and like they're picking everybody, which is like the worst because they're just sort of being shamed into, or ranked into, oh, well, you're up here and you're down here.
Yeah. I mean, that very much resonates. The goal for me pretty much every day in gym class was to get picked second to last, right? Just to not be the kid on the bottom.
Yeah. So I guess moving forward a little bit from there. So you're in Colorado now, but you didn't grow up in Colorado, right?
Yeah, I lived in Connecticut till I was 12. My folks got divorced when I was 8. And my dad moved out to Colorado, and I followed a few years later. And that was a difficult transition. Yeah, I think I had friends and I just still felt like a kid when I lived in Connecticut. But moving to Colorado was like the transition into junior high school was around the same time. And, kids start being a little bit crueler around age 12. So it was sort of a double whammy of difficulty, right? Transitioning into a junior high school rather than having your single classroom and your teacher that you knew, right? Versus as well as, having to make new friends at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So you really had to start all over again with this thing that was maybe already felt a little bit difficult, and you were like kind of starting from scratch in a whole new place. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, as a kid, you're not necessarily aware of the sort of macro landscape of all these things. You're just sort of living your own little life, right? At least for me, I felt like I had heard comments I was kind of a weird kid or whatever, but it was usually, but it was even from parents and teachers, but in kind of an endearing sort of way, right? But I think that wasn't perceived that way by my peers. But rather that sort of shyness and what was unique and endearing to parents was an opportunity to, to pick on me or whatever as an adolescent. Yeah.
Yeah. I think if the quote unquote popular kids hear that, that's sort of like sharks to blood, right? They're like, oh, there's somebody who's different, or
it's a vulnerability rather than potential strength.
Yeah. Right. And I think it's interesting to wonder about how you heard that at 12 years old or whenever you were hearing that. It may not be something that at that point you're able to understand through that lens of kind of like, I think that's kind of cool or funky or whatever.
Right. Just unique. You're artistic or whatever. I think that was how it was perceived by parents and teachers. And I heard that positively. I always felt like the adults in my life were pretty safe. Right. But it was, I think, more my peers that I struggled with. Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember any adults that were particularly helpful to you in that way or anything that, or maybe gave you some skills to try and deal with any of that stuff? Does anybody come to mind like that?
Uh, I don't have a great answer to that. I guess what I mean more is that I didn't get any sort of negativity around that
Okay.
personality trait from the adults in my life.
Okay.
It wasn't that they knew how to help me through it necessarily. It was more just that I wasn't being punished for it as I felt like I was maybe for my peers.
I see. Okay. I was kind of fishing for if there was advice that somebody had given you or something that you feel like was helpful. Although I'm also wondering that since so much of this was almost discovered sort of retroactively for you, you said it wasn't until you were 30 that you even had any idea that you maybe fit into this category of somebody with anxiety. So, I mean, it's possible that it was just not even something that was on your radar to quote unquote fix.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think I probably perceived my problems and challenges as mostly situational, right? Not as something that was kind of part of me, right?
Hmm.
It was like, oh, if only I were more popular, I wouldn't have these negative feelings, right? If I just had those fancy Nike tennis shoes, people would like
Yes.
me more, right?
Yes. That fixes everything, I've been told. The right shoes.
At least that was my perception at age
Yeah.
13, sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, that
That's
was why I wasn't like those other kids. Yeah.
right. Yeah. It's kind of, we chuckle at it now, but it shows you that difference in perspective, right? That at that point in your life, like that made a lot of sense to you and was
Yeah, you're
very,
looking around the world and you're trying to put patterns together, right? At least that's
mm,
that's who I was at that age. And I can remember just seeing a lot of the popular kids were really athletic and they wore certain shoes and certain clothes. And it was easy to just think if I had those, then maybe that would be the thing, right?
right.
Not recognizing that a lot of it had to do with my how I approached other folks in a social situations, right? That was maybe the reason for not being so popular.
Right. It's got to be the shoes, man.
That's right. That was a popular advertising
It
slogan.
was, yeah. I mean, I suppose it was popular for a reason, right?
Right.
Marketers are infamous
Into
for,
that.
yeah,
Sure.
getting into sort of the psychological makeup of particularly age group
Right.
and
Right.
being able to exploit it. So moving forward a little bit, so through junior high school and into high school, and can tell me about sort of what your high school experience was like a little bit.
Yeah, I had some urging from my grandparents. Actually, my cousin had attended a private school, and prior to this, I was in public school in Boulder, Colorado.
Hmm.
And it was suggested that I move on to the smaller private school, which I was initially pretty resistant to. But I think ultimately that was probably a better environment for me to flourish or at least do reasonably well. There were just fewer folks to contend with, and opportunities for bullying and so forth were much reduced with smaller class size and more of a teacher presence and things like that. And so
Yeah.
my exposure to getting beat up in the locker rooms and gym class and things like that kind of went away. It didn't mean that I didn't still have some difficulties there, but I think having the social environment be a little bit better controlled by adults was helpful.
Yeah.
You just with people who have more of an eye on that and aren't maybe so cruel
Hmm.
as kids that age can be, was certainly helpful. Yeah.
Okay. If there's, I don't know if I want to say if there's one thing, but it's certainly a significant thing that has been such a big difference between our generation growing up as kids as to the way it is now, I think is the bullying. The stuff that used to go on, it's just, when I think about it now, it's absolutely horrific. It's unbelievable that was maybe kind of a blind eye turn to that. And now it's just not tolerated at all. The incidences of it are far lower, and certainly the severity, I think, is much less. So
Yeah, I mean, that's great to hear. I think maybe enough generations like ours got exposed to it that we sort of said enough. We're not going to allow this, and
yeah.
For kids growing up, I'm sure it still happens in certain places, and there's
Sure.
definitely different ways of doing it. Right? Maybe it's less physical and more psychological, sort of cyberbullying type stuff.
Yep.
Even talking to my wife Beth, I know her experience with bullying was more or less purely psychological, right? Where I think for males it tended to be more physical, although it's often both, right? Sometimes the psychological effects of the physical bullying are really more profound than the bruises, right?
For sure. Yeah, I do think there is a bit of, I mean, we're obviously speaking really generally, but there is a bit of a gender difference there in terms of how that comes across. And absolutely the social media stuff that goes on now seems to be, it's just sort of a breeding ground for some of this stuff. So that was a positive experience then for you transitioning to that private high school, because just kind of less kids to maybe deal with some of that stuff and more of a teacher presence, as you're saying. And how about after that? So finished high school and you went to college after that?
Yeah, and I think in retrospect, this to circle back to the candy story from earlier.
Yeah.
It is interesting to me that I ultimately chose. I did apply to 5 or 6 colleges and went and visited a few. Got accepted at a number of them in other states. I think Oregon and New York and Vermont, and then ultimately just chose to go to school in my hometown, Boulder, Colorado. And in retrospect, I mean, a big part of that decision for me was the unknown and the sort of fear and really in retrospect, anxiety of the idea of moving to a new place and having to do all of the things that would require. Right. I think so many of my peers, I can remember hearing people say, they're just so excited to get out of this place, right? Like at high school graduation. And that was not my experience at all. I was like, I'm finally getting comfortable. I'm terrified of having to move on in the world. And I remember literally thinking like, oh, if I move to a new town, I'm going to have to like walk into a bank and ask how to like open a bank account. And just being like, I can't handle that. Like that's beyond me. That's just, I don't know. I'm going to look like an idiot. I'm going to like walk into the teller or like who do I ask? Like, I don't know how to do that. Yeah. And that was sort of a microcosm. Like that's just one small experience. But when I thought of that and the number of other things that would go along with that, right? Being in an unfamiliar town and having to figure out my way around it and new businesses and like shopping for myself and all of the things you already have to do and kind of learn anew when you go off to college, it just suddenly felt like, well, if I stay here, at least I won't have to do a lot of that, right? I'll have to figure out how to get to my classes and all that. But like learning how to be an adult, I think I was something I was very much afraid of at that age.
It's so interesting that so much of this stuff is circular, and that moving out right from Connecticut and that experience that you had when you were 12, and then that idea of like, oh, I could go somewhere else. And right away in your head, you're like, well, I don't want to repeat that again. Like, why would I do that? And even the bank example is kind of like the 5-year-old at the candy store, right? Like all over again, all these sort of circular things that it gets really easy to get pulled into. And we're not even necessarily conscious of at the time. And so much of your story is kind of this retrospective look at it, but it's hard to know when that's happening, that's what's happening, if you haven't had any experience trying to cultivate any sort of awareness around that stuff. I'm imagining you hadn't like gone to therapy or anything like that at this point, right? Like before.
No, I think very briefly in junior high school, my parents had me work with a social worker. I went once or twice. I felt like I got not much out of it, and I just maybe was unable to open up. I don't remember it very well, to be candid. So I didn't actually start, doing any kind of therapy until I was in my 30s.
Okay. All right. So stayed in Boulder then for college, and tell me what that experience was like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, prior to that, even I had begun drinking, and, in college, of course, it just became widely available, and there were no, limitations in terms of, oh, my parents are going to catch me if I come home. And really by then, I think my parents were even like, oh, once you go to college, you're sort of old enough to drink. Right. So just some previous experiences with alcohol, I think, are maybe worth digging into a little bit. The first time I drank, it was the night before the first day of 9th grade. So I'm pretty young. Okay. I was at a friend's house, and, I remember just like his parents were out of town. I had a glass or, a sip or two of whiskey, like right out of the bottle. And immediately just felt like just a sense of like relief of not, I don't know, just an ability to relax in a way that I had not experienced before, and I ended up getting quite drunk and very sick. And my folks made me go to class anyway. And I was vomiting between classes in the 9th grade. in high school, that pattern continued. It wasn't something I did regularly. I was a reasonably good student and I wanted to be, a good kid and not get cross with my parents or teachers. But on weekends, certainly friends and I would seek out alcohol and then later marijuana when we could. And I did just find pretty quickly kind of a quick and automatic solace in the bottle, right? That despite all the negative consequences initially, at least for years, that became a coping mechanism for what I sort of later I only recognized was maybe anxiety, right?
Uh-huh.
I think I considered myself a very shy person, and alcohol sort of instantly made me not so shy, right? Just kind of willing to put myself out there and be a different person and just be, judgment goes poorly and all that, but having less inhibition, I guess, is another way to describe having less anxiety, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It's interesting. And certainly, you're obviously not alone with people who self-medicate for anxiety, right? And I think also not alone in people who aren't even aware that that's what they're doing. It just becomes this so often. I think when you first hear about people having some experience with whatever substance, there's this immediate feeling of relief, or this is who I want to be, or I've been carrying around this backpack and now I'm taking it off, which, it makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, part of the allure, I think, of the substances is that they work.
Yeah.
And
people wouldn't do it. I mean, I can remember my stepmom saying to me when I was probably 14 years old, something like that, people are going to tell you that drugs are bad and there's plenty of pitfalls there, but they're lying to you if they say they're not fun. Like that's the reason people use drugs. Right. And it turned out she wasn't wrong. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like it works in the immediate sense, right? It's a very quick fix, right? You can have a drink and 15 minutes later, you might feel less anxious. But it's obviously got plenty of pitfalls there. And, some of them involve making a bigger ass of yourself and now being embarrassed about that. And now you're anxious to go see the same people again. And, this pattern of sort of repeating that cycle then became, probably most of my college years and 20s for me.
This sounds a lot like that next morning you woke up and you're like, oh God, what did I do last night? And I have to go sort of rectify whatever has happened. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, and of course there's an irony there, right? Because the anxiety about handling the damage you've caused with, your actions while drinking can often outweigh whatever relief you got from it. And then, of course, the only solution to that, that you're familiar with, or I
more
was
booze
at that time, was more booze, right? It's a Homer Simpsonism, cause of and solution to all of life's problems. And, I think so many people fall into that trap without realizing that this quick fix you're pursuing is preventing you from taking a step back and learning the skills you might otherwise learn to cope more in a healthier way, right? With the struggles that you're trying to fix.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's super interesting too, if you look at even the cycle of alcohol in particular itself that you go through when you have your first drink. You get, as you mentioned, it takes kind of 15 minutes or so, or it can be even faster than that. And you have the relief, right? You have the buzz and that kind of feels great and everything's alleviated and that's wonderful. But then for the body to process that, it takes another 2 hours to get out of your system. And it's a central nervous system depressant. So inevitably you are then brought down to a lower point than when you first started. And just as you were saying, the cure, quote unquote, is of course another drink, right? So you have your first drink and then 15 minutes later, like, maybe it's time for my second. So you essentially just kind of keep kicking the can down the road and, the bill doesn't come due until usually you wake up the next morning.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a kind of a vicious cycle, and yet it's a difficult one to escape, right? I don't know how many days in my 20s when I became apparent that I had a drinking problem, I would say to myself, I'm not going to drink tonight, or I'm not going to drink as much tonight. And yet, once I was working at a bar at the time. So, I show up and everyone's drinking around me, and it's just easy to say, what's the difference, right? So that bill that comes due, it has to be paid. But if you keep kicking the can down the road, the price just gets higher and higher, and it gets more and more daunting to sort of face the music, right?
Yeah. And then you potentially get to that place where you have this looming thing. And as you were kind of alluding to earlier, that in itself almost can be the thing that becomes something that you drink to avoid. And so now there's the other thing that's been created that wasn't even there in the first place. It's like, now you've really got a reason to drink.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about kind of where things went from there. I mean, typically in these sort of stories, there's that sense of, okay, maybe I should try to do something about this. Did you make attempts to moderate your drinking? Did you try to sort of curb it? And what did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a relatively long journey, and in retrospect, it's easy to see it in myself, and when I see it in others, around me who are still drinking and struggling with these things. It seems so obvious to recognize that the solution you have found is ultimately causing more harm than good.
Mm.
And I had moments or flashes of that for at least a decade, over a decade, before I finally took the final action and chose to get sober. So I can remember thinking, before I turned 21, that I had a drinking problem, and I was concerned a little that once I could now drink legally and go to bars and so forth, it would spiral and get worse. And I remember having the thought, I should just go out on my 21st birthday and have a big party and then just quit drinking, right? But that was not how my life went. So
surprising.
I was working at a bar, before and then again after I turned 21, and I just was surrounded by more and more folks who drank heavily. And, another, of course, factor there is it starts to become so normalized when you're surrounded by it.
Yeah.
And be in an environment where most of your peers are people who start drinking at 5 o'clock every day, fairly intoxicated, can start to give you easy justifications like, at least I'm not like that person, right? Folks, there's always somebody who's got it worse off, right? And it's easy to say, well, I'm not like that, but now I look back and think, God, to start doing shots at work, at 6 p.m. Like, did you not think you were going to be drunk? And then when you're doing that 5 days a week, even if you're not getting very intoxicated, it's pretty clear that that's excessive drinking, right?
Yeah. And
I had some flashes of realizations around it. And then I had some pretty significant consequences. When I was 24, I had a pretty bad car accident. I was with my girlfriend at the time and had a rollover accident where we ended up upside down and underwater in Porter Creek. Managed to sort of fight my way out of the car, got her out. We were both safe and didn't have a physical scratch on us, but I know she ended up going to therapy about that for a while. She was submerged for quite some time. And I just sort of laughed it off. And, I think I didn't drive drunk for a few weeks after that before it started slipping back into old patterns, right?
Yeah. Did you had such a dramatic incident? Do you remember thinking did any sort of warning alarms go off in your head, or did you just, as you said, just kind of laugh it off and somehow, I don't know, sort of justify it to yourself?
Yeah, I think I probably took it fairly seriously for a few days, but the lifestyle was just, I was so embedded in the lifestyle that I was in. At the time I had a second job. I was working at Merrill Lynch full time, and I was bartending 1 or 2 days a week, but it felt like my heart lied in the bar, right? That was the place where I identified with. I didn't care for my job in finance industry. I had a lot of friends at the bar, right? So many of whom were sort of drinking buddies and maybe not great friends, but that was where my social life was surrounded. So to walk away from that just seemed super daunting, right? And it was easy to sort of initially take like, well, I really got to be serious about not driving when I drink, right? But even with that, there's so many sort of slippery slope things that can happen, right? You say, well, it's totally legal to have one drink and drive, right? And even two is, I'm probably not over the legal limit, right? Well, and if you have three, but it's over an hour or two, then you're probably not. And, these small decisions start to add up. And over a period of, I don't know now, weeks or months, I found myself more or less engaging in the same behaviors I was in before, despite that. What could have been a pretty traumatic experience of being seatbelted underwater.
Yeah. It's so much of that pattern too, which I think you just really nicely described, but is that the initial sort of slippery slope of, oh, it's just one or it's two and I'm under the limit, blah, blah, blah. But of course, what happens is if you've had 2 drinks, as you were saying earlier, there go your inhibitions again and
Yep.
off you go.
Yeah. And it's just, it becomes easier and easier to rationalize, and then also, I mean, I didn't think about this at all at the time, but I may have also been drinking to process the traumatic experience.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the ultimate.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So where did things go from there? So you slipped back kind of into that pattern after the accident, and what happened after that?
Yeah, I eventually went back to bartending and working at a bar full time a couple of years, about a year after that, I guess. And then I bought a house up in the mountains, and I just kind of continued that lifestyle. For many years, I just worked at a bar. And so all of my friends, all my social groups were around that. I did feel like, well, I have fun most nights, right? The job itself was fun. It's social. You're around people. It's easier to meet women and things like this, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then there's music playing and just, I think I had a lot of negative experiences during that time. But for the most part, I still considered that my life was pretty positive, right? I managed to, it was like my mornings usually weren't so great and my evenings were usually really fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to repeat that pattern just day in, day out without really having time to step back and reflect on, is there a greater purpose? Is there something else I could be doing? Mm-hmm. And I think you start to get myopic if you're drinking all the time. It's easy to just sort of only think about today. Right. And rather than start to think about, what am I capable of a more meaningful job or position in life? Are there other things I'd rather be pursuing? It's easy to sort of be like, well, for now, I just have to nurse this hangover. And then I got to go to work tonight and I'll think about this later. And again, like we talked about before, it's sort of that kicking the can down the road, that turned out to last for me for a long, long time. Yeah.
Well, you're certainly not going to try to address any of those things that we were talking about earlier of, let me look at maybe why it is that I'm doing this, or, is there some underlying reason or anxiety that is causing me to do this stuff? It's just, you're not even close to being in that framework.
No, that certainly wasn't on my radar. Yeah. I was aware that my drinking itself was problematic, but did very little examination of why it was that I wanted to drink so much. Right.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, not having any, I guess, not much exposure to a group of people who were process oriented, right, would talk about these sorts of things, makes it much harder to even be aware of the problem, right? Like I said, if your peer group is all people who are engaging in the same sorts of behaviors rather than thinking, how do I better myself and how do I get out of this trap? It's much harder to do without this fellowship of other folks who recognize the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that speaks to the importance of just going back to that adolescent mindset for a minute of who you are surrounding yourself with and what are they trying to do with their life, because it's so important for you developmentally at that point, like what everybody else is doing, what your friends are doing, and everything else doesn't really matter. So that can be super positive or not.
Yeah, right. I guess if you have the right peer group around you and folks who are aspiring to better themselves, that can be positive. For me, I had just sort of found my way into a peer group of folks whose vision for themselves was somewhat limited and who were really just kind of looking to have fun today, right? And I lived my life that way very much for many years.
Okay. So how did you eventually get to a place? You said you decided to get sober and just quit drinking. And how did you get to that place? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So, I mentioned the first car accident. Well, it wasn't the last. And I actually had a couple more. In 2003, I wrecked a truck and hit a tree with it. I was okay, but I totaled the car. And if I'd had a passenger, I don't know they would have survived. That side of the car was destroyed. Then again, I stopped drinking for a few weeks. Again, I sort of tried, I think, as a lot of folks do who have a trouble with their drinking, to moderate, right? And, I initially just sort of thought, well, I just won't drink at all. And then thought, well, the occasional beer or two is not such a big deal. I don't want to have to give this up entirely. There's just often such a battle with something that's been a part of your life for so long to just think about even completely letting it go, especially when it's the sort of the primary tool you've used to address this underlying issue. I think it was too much.
Mhm.
And again, I didn't pursue any sort of peer group or support around it, right? I just said, it's the drinking itself that's got to change. And I found myself within a month or so of that drinking relatively heavily again. And I think that just only sort of escalated again. I did mention I dated someone when I was about 30 or 31, who was the first person who exposed me to the idea of that I might have an anxiety disorder. She just said it to me. She said, "Oh, you have an anxiety disorder," like as if it was quite obvious. And like, how had I never thought of this?
Uh-huh.
And that was interesting. I mean, I think I was sort of like, nah, at the time. I just didn't really recognize what it was that I was trying to address with all the drinking, right? And then later that year, I guess maybe when I was about 32 was when I finally sort of threw in the towel. I had another pretty significant car accident, another rollover. And, even then, a lot of that sort of slippery slope comes in. I can remember driving home and thinking to myself, like, don't drive too fast. Be really careful because you've had a few drinks. And, then a song came on the radio and I got excited and started driving fast. And pretty soon was trying to see if I could set a record for speed on this particular straightaway in my neighborhood. And then the next thing I knew, I was having a rollover. That was the moment for me, was when I realized the car came to a stop. I had kind of gone off a steep embankment, rolled the car a couple of times, hit a bunch of trees. And when the car came to a stop and I recognized, okay, hey, I'm still alive. And B, I'm in pretty good shape here. I recognized right away I had a broken arm, but it was otherwise okay. And I climbed out the sunroof. I sort of just climbed up this embankment to the road. And right away, I remember saying out loud, I am done. And just kind of falling into tears and just crying by myself on the side of the road. I knew I couldn't keep doing what I was doing or I was going to die. Yeah.
Wow.
So, that was the big sort of, I guess, watershed moment. I hitchhiked home and actually called the police myself and said, I was driving drunk. You're going to find my car. I basically wanted to get a ticket and to face the consequences at that point.
So interesting. There's this like moment of accountability there that like after all this avoidance that you were finally done.
Yeah. And, prior to that, I had several times taken a month off of drinking, right? Like I was starting to realize that this was not helping me. It had been clear for years, really, but, I kept trying to do battle and just negotiate with, bargain with, I guess, the fact that I couldn't just drink like a regular person and moderate, right? That's what I kept trying to do and just kept trying it a different way over and over. But really, the pattern just kept repeating itself. And I think that was finally the moment where I realized the number of drinks I can have is zero, or it's going to be however many I want, right? Once I start drinking, I just don't know what I'm going to do with myself that night. I'm an unreliable person once I begin. So I kind of just can't do it. And I think that was a scary thing to have happen. Probably, again, a little traumatic to be in that serious of a car accident. I easily could have been killed. I was going 80 miles an hour on a windy mountain road before my car left the road. So, very, very fortunate to get through that with really a minor injury. And I think that just kicked in for me, just instantly changed my sort of default approach to alcohol, rather than it being like, I can drink, but I need to moderate it. It just like a switch almost felt like it flipped for me, where I just said, I can't do that anymore. And the following morning, I called my father and told him about it. Pretty soon after that, I really wanted to sort of maybe make it kind of public and create some external accountability for myself too. I can remember, calling my grandparents and saying, I want to come over, and sitting down and telling them the decision I had made, right? My grandmother's father was someone who really struggled with alcohol, and she'd been around it quite a bit. And she said, I never knew this about you, but I just needed to put it out there to create some accountability where the embarrassment of drinking again would be so much that I was creating a like sort of external deterrent.
And and that outweighed that potential embarrassment of letting people know about this and creating that accountability for you.
Yeah, I think so. I know because of my current work that I think for a lot of people, the idea of saying I'm a person who doesn't drink, right? I'm a person in recovery is so stigmatized that itself is embarrassing for whatever reason. That once that sort of, metaphorical switch was flipped for me, I just knew I sort of had to face that, I guess. And I was willing to say it, because I think I had deep down a recognition I really was going to kill myself. If I continued doing what I was doing, I was going to have another car accident or something else that would kill me, and I had to stop. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It's so powerful. I mean, it really comes down to this sort of like live or don't live. So what did you do? I mean, you created that accountability for externally for yourself, and probably, I mean, also internally, I think, but what did you do from that point forward? And what are things like for you now?
Yeah. So that was 13 and a half years ago.
Wow.
So, I think the only thing I knew to do, just from reading about it and seeing movies and so forth initially, was AA, right? A 12-step program. And so when I first got sober, I did literally the day after I made that decision. I went to an AA meeting with my arm in a cast and sat in a room full of strangers and said, I'm an alcoholic. And there were a lot of tears. It was a cathartic moment for me. And I continued to go to meetings for 3 weeks or so, right? Just a pretty short period. I think I pretty quickly realized that there were some challenges for me with the model, right? And I don't mean to suggest that it isn't a model that works great for millions of people, because I know a lot of people for whom that's been super helpful.
Yep.
But for me personally, the higher power concept didn't resonate, and I really had trouble with that. It felt a bit dogmatic. There were just aspects of it that didn't resonate. And then unfortunately, I think a few months into my recovery, maybe about a month and a half, actually, I heard about an organization that had just been founded the previous year in Boulder. So I was really, lucky to be in the right place at the right time, which at the time was called Phoenix Multisport, since been renamed to the Phoenix. And my dad read about it in the paper. And the basic idea, I think, was, at the time anyway, was, they did a lot of physical activities together and sort of formed bonds through these activities, right? And so I thought, well, this just sounds great. I had been a pretty active person. Even when I was drinking, I had trained for and run a marathon with a lot of Gatorade and a lot of afternoon runs after sleeping till noon.
Yeah.
I was a skier. I was a relatively active person. And just finding, the idea of it just right away was like, wow, people who do these sorts of things who don't drink, like, this is what I need in my life, right? And so I went and attended an indoor rock climbing class in Boulder, I think a couple months after getting sober, I first heard about it. And, even there, the anxiety, I think, was present. Because I can remember driving up to where the event was going to be held and not having the courage to go in, right? That same, kid who doesn't want to go up to the counter to buy candy mentality is
back again,
extending itself. Yeah. And, it had never gone away, except that sometimes I would have gone in there with 3 drinks in my system to not worry about it. Right. And now I have that choice. But once I did, I was greeted by a really supportive group of folks. It was very positive, but not in a way that felt cloying or insincere, right? It was a genuinely supportive group of folks who could talk about themselves and the struggles they've been through and were willing to sort of share and be a bit vulnerable. They had some ground rules established about, how we treated one another in the group. And it was really important that everybody be welcomed and including the person who, comes in the day after me. And now I'm not the newest guy, right? And so having that sort of all laid out was really important. And I think, I found through that group, through Phoenix, one of the other things about them, I think, is rather than the sort of anonymous approach of having some shame and sort of, let's keep this quiet. As I said, I had sort of announced to everyone in my world, hey, I'm not drinking anymore. And that included all the people I worked with at the bar, right? For me, being public about it was important. And I didn't want to hide that. And maybe that was another thing about AA that didn't resonate so well for me, was this sort of notion. It felt the anonymous piece almost felt like it was something to be ashamed of and something to continue to hide. And now I know there's going to be folks who've got a 12-step background who'll say, hey, it's really just about keeping other people's anonymity and so forth. So
Sure.
don't mean to dwell on that. But that sense for me, it didn't work. And Phoenix had a different approach, which was, we've got T-shirts on them that say sober active community and bumper stickers. And the word sober was put out there publicly. And with a very intentional aim of reducing stigma around substance use disorder and just saying like, hey, we're people who are sober. Like, this is who we are. It's no big deal. And we're out here doing cool things, right? We're rock climbing and we're doing triathlons. And so for me, that really clicked. And right away, I think I was someone who was public on social media about it within a few months. And so just finding this other group who had that mentality and really maybe even pushed it in me was super helpful to me. I think the strength that you get from being willing to discuss it and then seeing all the support that you get, right, was huge. And even the other experiences of being able to help other people. I can think of someone I went to junior high school and college with who was a pretty heavy drinker who, several years into my sobriety reached out to me because he'd seen me posting things on Facebook about it and said, hey, can we talk a little bit about it? And we just exchanged some messages. And I know this person's been sober now for many years, and I'm not sort of claiming credit for that, but I think being there to be, one more potential mentor or advice giver at a crucial time in his life, like maybe that's one of the things that helped, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that public component of it can be really important. Yeah.
It's so interesting because it's like you went from, we talked so much about the avoidance, right, early on, to now you're at this place where you are sort of flying in the face of the stigma purposefully. And I do think, culturally, there's a lot less of that now than there used to be. But I think that probably, organizations like Phoenix are helping with that and just being very open around kind of what they're doing and who they are. And you found that fellowship there with them. And that's awesome. We've got to wind things down here in a second, but can you tell us a little bit if people are interested in that? Like, where can they find out more information about that?
Yeah. I did end up volunteering with and getting hired on with and now being a staff member at Phoenix for over a decade. And so, as I mentioned, the name has changed. It's now just the Phoenix. Our website is thephoenix.org. Okay. And on there, you can find a lot of different resources. We now offer, in addition to the sort of physical activities that I mentioned, that's been expanded greatly. All of our activities are intentionally designed to be really welcoming to folks of all backgrounds. Anyone who's chosen to get sober and has 48 hours of sobriety, even if they're maybe not committed to a sober lifestyle yet, is welcome to attend and check them out. They're all free. And we've started branching out into other activities besides the physical ones with the recognition that maybe that's not for everyone. So we started doing things like book clubs and meditation classes, dance classes, music events. So that's all available on the website too. You can click find a class. And there's a list of live streamed classes, which are great. You can access those from anywhere you've got an internet connection. We're now in 25 states as well. So wow. You can type in your zip code and see what's available nearby, if anything. And if not, hopefully there will be something soon. And especially as vaccine becomes more widely distributed, we're going to start doing more and more in-person events. Yeah. We've also just got some on-demand classes. If you just want to sort of in a low commitment way, just check out the feel of it, right? I think that's a good way to get a sense of what Phoenix is like. Yeah. It's very deliberately welcoming to folks. And we talk about that a lot, the difficulty of what we call the 5,000-pound door, which is that heavy door I felt the first time I pulled up to the rock club and didn't want to open that door. And how can we make that door lighter for folks, right? And so just trying to get the word out there and let people know. But once you walk in that door, you'll be greeted warmly and welcomed by folks who've been there in any number of different ways.
Well, I love it. It's awesome. I'll put all that information in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on today and being so open and vulnerable and sharing your story. I'm hopeful that this helps a lot of people. I know what you're doing sort of every day helps a lot of people. So I really I appreciate what you're doing and the way that you've kind of turned your life completely around to what it is. So it's awesome. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Steve. It's great to chat with you.
You too, man. Take care. All right, that was Rob Baumgartner. The organization that he works for is called The Phoenix, and their website is thephoenix.org. The only cost of going there is 48 hours of sobriety, and that's it. So really cool organization. They do a lot of different things that are active, from CrossFit classes to mountain biking to rock climbing to surfing, you name it. So check that out. And also, if you want to support the show, please do leave us a review. Be in touch with me either via the email on the website and the show notes, or on Instagram at The Anxious Child Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.